Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into feminist literary criticism. Really explore how it can transform our view of the world around us.
Yeah, it's super interesting to see how these big social movements kind of reshape our understanding of art and literature.
Exactly. So to get us started, we'll be looking at this excerpt from Dr. Jas van Rathard's work on feminist literary criticism. It gives a pretty good overview of the approach.
It really does.
One of the central arguments that we see in feminist literary criticism is this concept of patriarchy, right?
Mhm.
This system that has really privileged men and pushed women into these supporting roles throughout history, throughout Western civilization. Does that resonate with you at all?
Oh, absolutely. I immediately think about classic works of literature like Oedipus or Hamlet.
Yeah.
The men are always in the center. They're the ones with the agency. They're driving the action.
Mhm.
And the women are often relegated to these supporting roles, right? The mothers, the wives, the love interests. They don't have as much agency. And it makes you wonder, is that just a coincidence?
Yeah, it makes you think.
Or is this a reflection of, something bigger in society?
Yeah.
This structure where men hold most of the power.
It's a good question. I mean, it really makes me think about that famous Simone de Beauvoir quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman."
Yeah, right.
This whole idea that gender isn't just biology, but something that society shapes and reinforces seems very relevant here.
Oh, definitely. If we see gender as a social construct, as
Mhm.
something that's being shaped by forces around us,
Right.
then literature, as a reflection of society, also often reinforces these norms. So what feminist literary criticism helps us do is see those ideas playing out on the page.
Right. It helps you unpack them, see how they're working. And Dr. Rathod highlights these two major waves of feminist literary criticism.
Yeah.
Starting in the 1970s, where you have these critics that are really focused on exposing the mechanics of patriarchy, often by analyzing works by men, by male authors. They were pretty confrontational, from what I understand.
Yeah, there's a real sense of urgency to call out these imbalances, these injustices that were happening.
Yeah.
But then, by the 1980s, things start to shift a bit. This second wave emerges, and it's much more diverse. It draws on all these other fields like Marxism and psychoanalysis to kind of expand its toolkit.
Right. It starts to really branch out. And there's this move to rediscover and celebrate women's voices, too, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just about critiquing. It's also about building this new canon of literature, highlighting these stories that have been traditionally ignored or overlooked.
Exactly. Feminist criticism isn't just about tearing down the old. It's about building something new, creating a richer and more inclusive understanding of literature as a whole.
That's a good point. So within the field of feminist literary criticism, there are several different schools of thought, right?
Mhm.
Different approaches.
Hmm.
And the first one we'll look at is Anglo-American feminism.
Okay.
And I understand that they really emphasize the use of kind of traditional literary analysis to understand how women are depicted.
Yeah, absolutely. They would look at things like theme, character development, historical context, to try to see how are women being presented in a particular work.
Right.
And a key figure here is Elaine Showalter. She developed this concept of gynocriticism, which is specifically focused on literature that's written by women.
Interesting. So for so long, the literary canon has been dominated by male voices, male perspectives.
Absolutely.
And gynocriticism is trying to shift that focus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It says, you know what, women have their own literary traditions, they have their own unique perspectives and experiences, and we need to bring those to the forefront, right?
Right.
So suddenly, genres that were often dismissed in the past, like, say, the domestic novel, become much more interesting right
Yeah,
now.
they're seen in this new light. It's like rewriting history in a way, shifting the focus to the stories that weren't being told.
Absolutely.
Now we have a very different approach with French feminism.
Okay.
And this is where things get a little more complex because they're drawing on all these ideas from post-structuralism and psychoanalysis.
Right. Thinkers like Lacan and Derrida were huge influences on this branch of feminist criticism.
Okay.
And a key concept here is something called écriture féminine, and it was coined by Helene Sixes. It's this idea of a way of writing that breaks free from all these traditional structures of language, a way of expressing female experience that isn't limited by those old patriarchal rules.
I have to admit, that sounds a little abstract to me.
Yeah.
Like, how do you actually define that when you're looking at a piece of writing? What does that look like?
It's a challenging concept, and it sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah.
And there are other prominent figures like Lucy Irigaray, who talks about woman's writing, and Julia Kristeva, who introduced the semiotic.
Right.
And all of these ideas kind of seek to challenge the way that language and thought have been historically dominated by men.
Okay, so we've got these complex French feminists over here. Yeah. But then we have another branch, which is Marxist feminism. And if I had to guess, I'd say they view women as an oppressed class, much like the working class in traditional Marxist thought.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
They're using those tools of Marxist analysis to understand how women are being portrayed.
Okay.
And so here, you've got to think about Louis Althusser and his ideas about ideology.
Right.
He argued that these cultural messages, like the ones we find in literature, shape how we understand gender. We're interpellated into these roles, often without even realizing it.
Can you give me an example of that, of how we're being interpellated?
Sure. Think about children's toys.
Okay.
You know, girls' toys are often pink and focused on domesticity, like playing house or taking care of babies.
Right.
While boys' toys are often blue and focused on action and adventure.
Right, right.
And so these seemingly simple things actually play a huge role in shaping a child's understanding of what it means to be a girl or a boy.
Oh, that's a good point. I never thought about it that way, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
So like a Marxist feminist might analyze how a movie, for example, reinforces these traditional gender roles.
Absolutely.
Even if it doesn't explicitly come out and say it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They might look at how the film portrays women as passive or dependent on men.
Right.
Even if it's not consciously trying to push that agenda. It's
Right.
about looking at these underlying messages and power dynamics.
That's so interesting. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground already. We talked about Anglo-American feminism, French feminism, Marxist feminism, but we haven't even touched on Black feminism yet.
Right. This is where the field gets even richer.
Okay.
Black feminism really critiques both gender and racial biases.
No.
So the experiences of Black women are often very different from those of white women, and Black feminist critics are really bringing that to the forefront.
That's a really important point because their voices and perspectives are so crucial to understanding the full scope of gender inequality.
Absolutely. And a key figure here is Barbara Christian. Her work has been so influential in pushing the field to consider these intersections of race, gender, and representation.
Yeah, it's so important. Before we move on too much further, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with some of these terms we're using. We've been talking about feminist, female, feminine.
Right.
And I think those terms can get confused pretty easily.
They can. Toril Moi makes some helpful distinctions here.
Okay.
She argues that feminist is a political stance, right? It's a belief in equality, a commitment to challenging this gender-based oppression. But female, on the other hand, is simply a biological category. You can be biologically female without necessarily identifying as a feminist.
So you could be female without being a feminist, but could you be a feminist without being female?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And it kind of speaks to the complexity of these terms.
Yeah.
While, feminist movements have historically been led by women, there are certainly men who identify as feminists and who are actively working to dismantle these patriarchal structures.
That makes sense. So where does feminine fit into all of this?
Feminine is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Moi argues that feminine is a cultural construct.
Okay.
It's not about biology. It's about this set of traits and roles that society kind of imposes on women.
So it's not about inherent qualities, but about expectations.
Exactly.
Like how society might expect women to be nurturing or passive, even though those traits aren't necessarily tied to their biology.
Right. Recognizing that feminine is a construct helps us challenge those expectations and kind of open up new possibilities for how women can exist in the world.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. It really makes you think about how much of what we see as like natural for men and women is actually, shaped by these cultural forces around us.
Yeah, it's all kind of coming together for me now. So feminist literary criticism is about untangling all of these layers, right? Patriarchy, gender roles, cultural constructs, and how they're woven into these stories we read.
Exactly. And how those stories, in turn, actually shape our understanding of the world,
It's not just about analyzing literature for the sake of analyzing literature. It's about using literature as this tool to really think critically about these big ideas like gender and power.
Right, to start these important conversations that we need to be having. And I'm starting to realize that feminist literary criticism isn't this like one monolithic thing. you know?
Right.
We've got these different ways, different schools of thought, each with its own unique approach.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, what unites these different approaches is ultimately this commitment to challenging gender inequality,
Mhm.
promoting social justice.
Mhm.
There's a lot of diversity within the field, but that's kind of the core principle that holds it all together.
Yeah, and it's been so crucial in like recovering the works of all of these female authors
Mm.
that have been forgotten or overlooked over time.
Yeah.
It's like opening up this whole library of perspectives that we might have missed otherwise. It really is. Feminist literary criticism has, I think, enriched our understanding of literature so much by bringing these voices to the forefront. And it can change how we read even the most familiar texts, you know.
How so? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, sure. Let's take Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
Okay.
A
Yeah.
classic, right? A traditional reading might focus on the romantic entanglements of Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy.
Right.
But when we look at it through a feminist lens, we start to see, wait a minute, Austen's actually critiquing the social constraints that were placed upon women, especially in the 19th century.
Okay.
So suddenly, Elizabeth's wit and independence, her refusal to conform to these expectations placed upon her, become even more meaningful, you know?
It's interesting. I've never really thought about Pride and Prejudice in that way, but it makes total sense.
Right.
It makes me want to go back and revisit it with these new eyes.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. It encourages us to kind of think critically and engage with literature in this whole other way.
So let's bring this back to our listeners for a second. Why should someone who maybe has never even heard of feminist literary criticism care about any of this?
Well, for one thing, it can help you become a much more critical reader in general. It encourages you to kind of question your assumptions, you know,
Mm-hmm.
to look beyond the surface, to think about those power dynamics that might be at play in any book you pick up, any movie you watch.
It's like you're suddenly given this whole new set of lenses to see the world through.
Exactly. And it can also help you understand the world around you better, too.
How so?
Well, you know, feminist literary criticism gives us this framework for thinking about things like gender roles, power structures, the ways in which culture shapes our understanding of ourselves and each other.
Mm-hmm.
And these aren't just concepts that exist in books, right? They're playing out in our everyday lives.
Yeah, it's not just about literature, it's about life. The way we interact with each other, the expectations we place on ourselves and others, the messages we're bombarded with, in the media. All of these things are being influenced by gender, whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. And so feminist literary criticism can help us kind of untangle those influences and make us a little more aware, I think.
I'm starting to think this is something that, everyone should learn about, regardless of their background or their interests. It's just that relevant.
I agree. It can be a really powerful tool for understanding the world and for potentially even changing it.
And who knows, it might even make reading more enjoyable.
For sure. It's like you're unlocking these new levels of meaning, new ways of interpreting. You start to see familiar stories in this whole new light, uncover all these layers of complexity that you may have missed before.
I love that. It's not about making literature feel like academic or stuffy or anything. It's about bringing it to life.
Exactly. It helps us connect with literature on this much more personal level.
Yeah.
Because it invites us to reflect on our own experiences and beliefs.
Yeah, for sure. So, as we wrap up this second part of our deep dive, I think the key takeaway here is that feminist literary criticism is not just some obscure academic theory. It's this really powerful tool for understanding the world, for challenging inequality, and for appreciating the richness and diversity of literature.
And it's not static, right?
Yeah.
It's this ongoing conversation. It's a field that's constantly evolving and responding to all of these new social and cultural developments.
Which is exciting. It is exciting. It's cool to think that there's always something new to discover, always new ways to approach these ideas.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's one of the things that makes feminist literary criticism so engaging, right?
Yeah.
It kind of keeps us on our toes. We got to stay curious, got to keep asking questions, and never stop learning.
Yes, I like that. So, as we leave our listeners with one final thought, what's something they can take from this deep dive and maybe apply to their own reading, their own, viewing experiences?
Okay, well, here's a question I'd like you to think about.
Yeah.
How might looking at your favorite book or movie through this feminist lens that we've been talking about actually change your understanding of it?
Yeah.
Would it change it? How?
That's a great question. It really is.
Thank
Maybe you'll see all these layers of meaning that you never noticed before.
Mm.
Or maybe you'll even start to question some of the assumptions that you've always held about the characters or the story itself.
Right, right. Like those things that you've always taken for granted. Maybe they're not so simple after all.
Exactly. It's like an
Eh,
invitation to really engage with the art that you love on this much deeper level, and in a way to see the world with fresh eyes. So we want to thank you all for tuning in and taking this deep dive with us into feminist literary criticism. As we've seen, it's this really rich, rewarding field. There's always more to learn. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and yeah, happy reading.